So my name is Pete Kazanji. I'm super stoked to be in, is that bigger now? You guys see okay? Cool. Very stoked to be in Philadelphia. I think the last time I was here for like an extended amount of time was on an academic decathlon trip in my senior year of high school. We got to do like the Rocky thing, running up the stairs at the Institute of Art. So I'm stoked to be back here. A little bit of background on me, and then we'll talk about what we're going to talk about today. So I was the founder of a company called TalentBin. It has a bunch of Philly connections as well. We were backed by first round capital. I was going to wear an Eagles jersey, but then I figured like a first round jacket was kind of like the startup equivalent to that in Philly. But first round was one of our backers. Actually, Monetate was one of our first customers. And so TalentBin was a recruiting search engine tool. It's kind of like LinkedIn Recruiter for the entire internet. And it was actually a pivot out of a company called Honestly.com, which is a Yelp for people. Didn't work out. But what happened was when we pivoted out of that, all of a sudden now we were in the enterprise. And so we needed somebody who could then go and sell this. And so it was kind of one of those things where my co-founder and I looked at each other and were like, all right, who's going to do this? You like to talk on the phone. This is your job now. And so my background was not in sales at all. I'm just going to start my timer here so I don't get so I make sure that I'm on track. My background was not in sales at all. So I started out as the first like founder turned rep, then our first sales manager as I hired more people, then like our first VP of sales when we got to initial scale. Our initial scale was 20 reps, 20 CS reps before we got acquired by Monster. Then I went in 2014, went over to Monster, led new product sales there. Rick and I were talking about this earlier. It's the different challenge of enabling a legacy sales organization that's not used to selling new technology in a kind of like a persuasive fashion. I was there for about a year, and so now I'm writing a book called Founding Sales, because one of the things that I ran into as like me up here, the first rep turned founder, was I turned and said, there must be documentation on this. Like, there's got to be a book. And I went and looked, and there wasn't a book. There's a bunch of content marketing. There's Aaron Ross's Predictable Revenue, which is sweet when you're later stage, like go from 100 customers to like 1,000 customers. But there wasn't anything that comes kind of like right after the lean startup. So there wasn't that. And I was like, okay, well, given the fact that I just kind of like figured this out by eating bowls of glass for the last 4 years, now I'm gonna write it down. So that's what I'm working on right now. For the purpose of this, what this presentation is on sales presentations for founders. It's an adaptation of a chapter in the book that was published on First Round Review. I just tweeted this deck because this deck is structured to be consumed. I haven't presented it live before, so hopefully there aren't too many bumps, but it's structured in a way that you can consume it offline. There's enough kind of textual information on that you can go back to it, so I wanted to make sure that you guys had it as a canonical reference. It's on my Twitter profile right now. You can go check it out, have it in your back pocket. But this is really all about sales presentations. So where do people mess up on their sales presentations? We'll talk a little bit about that, and then we'll talk about how I think one of the framework I use for how you should think about putting your sales presentation together. The first thing that founders oftentimes mess up is using their fundraising presentation or kind of like pieces of their fundraising presentation for their sales presentation. They're different audiences. So like this is a good example right here. I ended up like I get a lot of founders approaching me, especially in the human capital management, kind of recruiting space, sales operations space. And they send me their sales deck, and this is actually a slide from a YC company when they sent me their sales deck, and this was the first slide. And I was like, you know, this is probably not the slide that you want to present to a recruiter that you're sitting down in front of and telling them that they suck at their job. This might be something that you'd be okay presenting to a venture capitalist and saying, there's a lot of brokenness in this space, we're going to fix this. So sales materials are for selling to your prospect who has a different mindset. Secondarily, the other problem I see a lot, and the kind of the summation, I think kind of the root cause for a lot of these things is the fact that as founders, we have a ton of things that we're trying to do, and prioritizing to get to the point where you build some tooling for yourself before you go to market can oftentimes feel like always the fourth priority. Like Rick was joking about this earlier over email. When I sent him this, he's like, wow, this actually I should probably add a couple more sections to our sales deck. And he's, this is not his first rodeo. So the other kind of failure mode I see with founders a lot is this notion of like, oh, we just do demos because the product speaks for itself. And demos are really great. The problem is that demos are only like one component of the sales presentation. And if you haven't set up proper context for the prospect and like frame their mental model and teed up the pain points and teed up kind of the market landscape, you're really just going to be doing a rehearsal of a bunch of features. And then we have this, and then we have this, and then we have this, and it's not going to resonate. So those are kind of the two big failure modes I see. I'm sure there's others. The way to think about a sales deck is that the goal of it is it's an artifact that is used to visually and textually present your narrative, your argument, right, your sales argument, to your ideal customer, the person who actually has your pain points, that convinces them to buy your solution. And oftentimes what I see people saying is like, oh, but like I'm not a designer, it's going to look like crap. That's okay when you start out. And moreover, like, oh, well, there's like so many. I was having this conversation last night with somebody via email when they're like, well, I'll send you our new one because I want you to have the latest and the greatest. It doesn't, at any given point in time, it doesn't have to be comprehensive. And then moreover, it doesn't necessarily, related to these, it doesn't have to take a ton of time. It can be very MVP to start out. And so that would be the thing that I would recommend to folks who are selling B2B is just think about it like your product. Start MVP. It's going to change. It's going to grow over time. But importantly, something is better than nothing. Like something is better than just like doing a raw demo that doesn't have the context. So, what are the parts of your deck? This right here is a narrative framework that is actually from another chapter in the book. If you guys want to Google first round sales narrative, again, the hyperlink is there. You can go back to it. But essentially, this right here is just, it's an argument, right? The problem, who has it, the cost of the problem, what the existing solutions are, and why they don't work, where their failures are, because that's what we're going to solve with our magical solution. What's changed in order to enable these things, and then a bunch of proof points, and then kind of blocking and tackling around pricing. So we're going to go through actual examples of these slides. From a number of different companies that I've worked with. So this is going to be super talent bin heavy, sorry. I hope you guys are excited about learning about recruiting software. But there's also some other folks too. There's a company called Affirm, they do payments. There's a company called Textio, super awesome job posting, optimization, machine learning magic. There's Immediately, it's an iOS email client and CRM client for sales folks. Life Guides is a recruitment branding company, and Hireable is a revenue acceleration software for recruiting agencies. And again, the idea here was that you guys would have examples of this to come back to when you're working on your own stuff. So starting at the beginning, the problem and who has it. This is actually extraordinarily important, and this correlates to what your pitch will end up looking like. Is if you just dive into the answer without actually even starting with the problem, you're totally putting the cart before the horse. You want to start at the beginning, and you want to help because this helps with qualification. If you're talking about the problem, and lo and behold, the prospect doesn't have it, great. Like figure that out and stop the conversation, as opposed to just like continuing to like spout at them. The idea of the problem and who has it is you want to tee up your issues that you're later going to address with your features. As you'll kind of know, you'll hear like this kind of sounds like product management turned into like words and pictures. It kind of is, right? You have use cases and you have kind of like solutions. This is the same sort of thing. And then of course you can have permutations of that. You can have, an overarching representation of this. You can also have more detailed versions thereof. So let's talk about some examples here. This is a slide from Immediately. I think it does a pretty good, it's pretty arresting when you start out. Like what's the problem Immediately solves? Oh, I don't know, 2/3 of sales reps, time is not spent selling. Sounds like a big problem. So there's a nice headline there. And then what I like about this is that it goes into kind of like the subcomponents of what that problem is. So like, oh, okay, what else are they spending their time on? Oh, they're spending their time on CRM updates, reporting, meeting prep, et cetera. And then they cascade down to the next step, which is, okay, and then like what are the negative implications associated therewith? And in this case, it's lower close rates, incomplete reporting, et cetera, et cetera. Pretty good job of kind of like framing that argument for you. One way they could do better here is this is mainly rep focused. you can imagine having one that follows right after this that is like sales manager focused. Like, okay, your sales reps have this problem, and then you as a sales manager, who's probably the decision maker or the sales operations person, you have this problem. So that's kind of like a one-slide example of this. This is an example from Life Guides where they kind of cascade through a series of these. So Life Guides makes recruitment branding software. So the biggest challenge that they're addressing with recruiting organizations is that folks are trying to figure out whether or not they want to work at Boomi or Monetate or Guru or what have you. And so what they do here is they frame all the places where people are checking you out, and then they dive into unit examples of this, right? So you could, like the MVP version of this is just one example, and then like kind of the next version of this is to kind of break it out. So in this case, I actually would have put this slide second, but this is like kind of the second problem case. Like, okay, they're researching you, but then when they get on your job page, it sucks, and here's why, for instance. I would have had this one go first, but problem case number one, they search for you, they end up on Google, and it's full of Glassdoor reviews, saying bad things about your company. Let's fix that. And then here's another unit example of that. And then when they click through to that, here is this. And so what they do is each time they're kind of giving this the problem case example, and the recruiter or the prospect in question is like, yeah, I get that. Yes, I have that pain. Yes, I have that pain. Yes, I have that pain. And then these guys that do, this is kind of the example I was talking about before, where you can start out broad, go into specifics, and then kind of roll back up again. It's almost kind of like a paragraph. I'm going to tell you this thing. Here are these things I told you. Or sorry, here's this thing, here's this thing, here's this thing. Here are these things I told you. And roll it back up again in kind of like a conclusionary slide. They do a pretty good job of that right here. One thing I think that is really helpful is in setting mental models for folks. This was an example with TalentBin. One of the big problem cases that we solved was people who have crappy LinkedIn profiles and thus are not findable via LinkedIn Recruiter. And so in order to address the root cause of that, or at least frame the root cause of that for folks, we had to characterize like, okay, why is it that software engineers have crappy LinkedIn profiles? Well, it turns out that like sales reps and business development people use LinkedIn all day long, whereas software engineers are in their IDE, Stack Overflow, GitHub, and Twitter all day long. Well, and Hacker News. So making sure that was apparent to recruiters up front then helped tee up the other, like, oh, okay, that is the root cause that then precipitates the actual example of what this looks like. The guy on the left here is one of my sales reps, so a very data-rich profile that would come back in search results versus a very data-poor profile that's on the right. It's a buddy of mine from college that gives the example of like, this guy is a JavaScript and Python animal at Google, but he doesn't have any of that information on his LinkedIn profile. But again, this is a crystallization of this higher level root cause. And then we went to the next pain point, which was, and then the implication of this is that now you have folks who, you either can't find them, the folks who can be found are getting completely inundated with in-mails, which then the implication of that is that people don't respond to those in-mails, and then we kind of cascaded through like the reactions to that. In-mails are ignored, in-mails are turned off, candidate nukes his profile. So the idea here was that, kind of like with Life Guides, we went through granularly. We did the same thing with, you can do it on a per pain point basis. So the pain point here is candidate responsiveness. And we had a bunch of features that eventually solve this. The pain point here that we're crystallizing is search results. So if people like John here, he goes by Fargo in case you guys see him. He's from Fargo. If he doesn't have Python and JavaScript on his LinkedIn profile, when you search for Python and JavaScript in the San Francisco Bay Area, he's not going to come back and search. Well, this right here is a roll-up of that problem across. So what you can see is like, oh, we have a lot of results for software engineer, but then as we get into more specifics, the results kind of fall off a cliff here. And you can do a macro version of that as well. So that's primarily, as you can see, there's a bent here towards data. What you can also do is you can have anecdata, as I like to call it. So better if you have this. This can be helpful as well, where you can say, hey, here are people who are reputation issuers in your space who say that this is a problem. And as a result, you should believe that this is a problem also. You can do both. So that's problem, right? The problem and who has it. Then the next step is, okay, well, so what? The cost of the problem. I didn't do as great a job with this section, but I think this is a really important thing is that like people have, especially with the growth of SaaS, people have lots of things that they could potentially be implementing, and so what you have to do is characterize that this is maybe like in their top 3 of things that they need to solve, and the way that you do that is by crystallizing the actual like cost or actual opportunity cost of the problem in question. So much better if you can do it on a holistic basis, but you can also do it on a per kind of pain point basis, as you saw. Costs are better if you can use proxies. That can also, if you don't have costs, you can use proxies for those costs. So what does this look like? Let's go back to immediately. So notice that their biggest pain point was your sales reps are spending 2/3 of their time not selling. And the way that they contextualize this, they say, and by the way, you pay them $75 an hour. So 2/3 of their time, you're just setting that money on fire. So it's pretty good. They also do, they get a little granular here as well. So minutes wasted per day on CRM updates, right? This is obviously teeing up a later feature talking about the fact that they make CRM updates like really easy from the iOS app. This is a more, this is a more base level example. This is the company Hireable, where they talk about just all the different kind of metrics associated with the pain point that they're solving. So 1 in 300 candidate submissions results in a backdoor hire. So backdoor hire is when you're a recruiting agency, you submit a candidate to a company, they get hired, but the company doesn't tell you, so you don't get your $25,000 fee. It's kind of a problem. And so one of the things that they do a good job of here is they frame the cost in the context of that prospect. So the prospect is sitting here saying like, oh, okay, well I know that I do 10,000 submits a year. Or they say, oh, I have 10 recruiters, so that means that there's anywhere between 10 and 30 fees that are being missed a year. That's a really important thing to do, is to keep it simple for folks so they can immediately do the math in their head, so they can understand like, whoa, okay, if I believe you, Rick, this is the cost that I'm eating on an ongoing basis. Next topic is existing solutions and their challenges. So as you can see, we're kind of progressing along this argument, like you have this pain, here's what it's costing you, you're probably trying to solve it this way, and here's why it's not good. Or here's what, here's the cost associated with this. It can be a little touchy between addressing how they're currently solving things versus like straight up competitive conversations. I don't like to bring competition straight into things immediately because it can kind of take things sideways. But for instance, like with TalentBin, every recruiter we were talking to used LinkedIn Recruiter. So by taking advantage of that, we could say this is why we are substantially better than this along these vectors right here. And so how can you do that? You can use quantitative indicators here. So this is a good example. Remember the pain point we were talking about was like profile recall and having good search results? All right, well, prove it to me, Pete. Sure. You search for Ruby on Rails in the San Francisco Bay Area, TalentBin brings back 50,000 results, LinkedIn gives you 13,000, and there's no resumes in Dice, so why are you wasting money on that? So this correlates to that pain point. But numeric is good. You can also do qualitative, even if you're just kind of saying like, and here's the implications of how you're currently solving this. This is one of the places where I think it's very helpful in helping people understand why they want to act on this right now. One part of that obviously is like, here's the magnitude of the cost that you're eating, or here's the magnitude of the opportunity cost. Where you can also do, and VCs like this too, is like, what has changed to enable this? Either what has changed to make this problem a huge problem right now, or make this problem show up, and like what has happened to make it such that now your solution can exist. And so it doesn't have to be a whole history lesson, but so I'll use TalentBins as an example. We kind of talked in terms of a timeline about how there are all these different data sources that were proliferating on the web that had professional information on them about candidates, right? And so this is an opportunity for folks to be like, oh yes, I do get it, that now there's this opportunity. Or alternatively, if they weren't quite a student of the game, this was an opportunity to educate them about how there's this new opportunity. And we had kind of unit examples of that. So you can imagine what this looks like for, typically, this is a visual representation of what precipitated your solution. Like you as an entrepreneur saw an opportunity in the market and then like went to jump on it. And so this is just a visual representation thereof to frame it to the prospect. How your solution works. This is kind of touchy because I don't think, one of the things that folks can get a little over-exercised with is doing demo via slide, and you don't necessarily want to do that, but having your slide or having your solutions, your buckets of your features that tie back to those pain points, which we validated with cost magnitude, can be helpful. You don't want it to be in substitute for a demo, but if for whatever reason you can't do a demo, or alternatively, if they're going to take it and bring it back to their boss or some other stakeholder, having that information present along with visual representations of ROI and proof points on a per feature basis can be super helpful. So I'll give you an example of this. First is I like concept visualizations. Like Rick's nodding right now because I imagine like explaining booming to people must have been hysterical. So in this case, the notion of an aggregated profile was like super complicated for a lot of recruiters because it was brand new. And so we had to come up with a visualization of this so they got it. They're like, oh, okay, I get it. You take all these things, you put it in a funnel, magic happens, and out comes a profile. As opposed to, because they were only used to people creating resumes for themselves and putting it into a database or creating their LinkedIn profile. You can also contextualize between old world and new world. So in our case, we would say, yeah, you're familiar with LinkedIn Recruiter, right? It's like God search on top of the LinkedIn database. We're like that for the internet. People would get it. So you can frame off of somebody else, and you can draft off of their mental model for somebody else. In terms of how the solution works, this goes back to the MVP concept, which is you don't have to boil the whole ocean to start out with. You can kind of take what I like to refer to as like a fractal model, like zoom in approach, where you're going to have your buckets of your features. So in Talentbin's case, it was find candidates, get context, reach out to them, and stay on top of your pipeline with automation. But then each of these chapters broke into sub-chapters as well. And depending on how much time you want to put into the collateral or how much time you have for the presentation, you can choose how deep you want to go. So in this case, this is a breakout of this guy right here. Oh, you can reach out using available communication vectors. That sounds cool, Pete. What does that mean? Oh, well, you can integrate with your corporate Outlook and Gmail. We have smart mail merge templates. We have open and click tracking, so you know that people are, which candidates are engaging with your stuff. We do mass mailing. We also have drip marketing. Oh, okay, I understand. And then the most granular version of that would be on a bucket by bucket basis representation of what that looks like. Again, this isn't just like a screenshot of the feature and say like, hey, we have, well, the next slide will be this, but hey, we have drip marketing, but instead it's, oh, okay, a visual representation of what it is that you're talking about. So in this case, drip marketing, okay, here's a series of emails. They kind of get it quickly, but then also ROI signifiers to that. So the reason why this exists is because now you have a 2 to 5 times greater open and response rate. Because remember, we talked about how annoying it is that no one ever gets back to you on LinkedIn, and we agreed that that was a pain point earlier because in the pain point section, and how much time you waste on outreach on LinkedIn Recruiter when it doesn't get responded to. Here's your solution for it, right? It ties together. It can be basic. This is a pretty terrible slide that I put together. But at the same time, it's kind of like this one right here. It correlates to that mass mail functionality, right? So it's helpful when somebody comes back to it and it's like, oh, that's right. What were the different ways that this allows me to reach out to folks? This is a visual representation of the Affirm workflow. One of the reasons why I like this is kind of like their version of this, I would say. Little better looking than the production value on our slides. One of my favorite things about this slide right here is the headline where it says Affirm just looks like a credit card to your system. So if you use GSI Commerce or Magento or like whatever, don't worry, just looks like a credit card. And by the way, here's how that works. You can also do kind of more conceptual representations of features that don't necessarily, this is if you have design resources, which we never had. And it can be even something as straightforward as like a quasi-demo, or like a thing that just sits there, you can kind of give a demo across. So Hireable doesn't really have all that complicated of a product. Like, hey, give us all your submittal information from your CRM. We then crawl the web to figure out whether or not they're at that company that you submitted them to, and then we tell you how much money you have to go and collect from those different folks. Pretty straightforward, so they don't need a lot of nuance, and so this works really well for them. Folks here might have solutions that are similarly very straightforward, even and powerful. Demo. This is normally the section where you would have a demo as well, and I think this is something that you'd want to be mindful of, is to not belabor things that you can cover in a demo, because the nice thing about demos is you can be very customized with them. First Round Review just published a chapter I wrote on demo scripts. You can go, the hyperlink is right here, you can Google it too, but you don't want to be, you want to take the opportunity to be as customized as possible, and that's why I kind of caveated at the beginning, you don't want to just walk through slide after slide after slide of screenshots. They're helpful after the fact because you can tie ROI information to them. Quantitative proof of a better solution. So as the argument kind of progresses, we talked about how you've got this pain point, we're going to validate that you have this pain point, we're going to validate the magnitude of the pain, we're going to say why the current solutions are insufficient, we're going to talk about what has changed and how we're exploiting that in order to make a better solution for you, and now we're actually going to prove to you that this is a better way of doing this. And the way that we're going to do this is with numbers. Ideally that are correlated back to those, the pain points that were already validated and agreed upon. Best way to do this is with ROI proof, either money in terms of pure cost savings, or money in terms of opportunity costs that you're eating on an ongoing basis. If you can't get to, that's the best. If you can't get there, you can do ROI precursors, which we'll talk about. And again, you want to tie it to those pain points and those features. So this is Textio right here. This is a super basic slide because they have like a 10 slide sales deck, and they're doing like many hundreds of thousands of dollars in MRR. And so what are the examples they use here? They say, oh, well, you get this lift in applicant count. You get this lift in screening rate. You get this reduction in time to fill. So these are metrics that as a recruiter, or if your solution addresses salespeople or what have you, or sysadmins, that this would resonate for them. They would say, oh, okay, wow, 40% more applicants for a given amount of media spend. That's sweet. Because then I can either get more candidates or I can reduce my media spend by 40%. That's actually how these guys could do a better job with this slide, is they could actually correlate it to those, like the next step. The implication is like, okay, well, if there are more applicants, that is good because of this, and that is good because of this. They stop just short of that here. This is some blinded ROI studies from Hireable. I think having kind of unit examples is really powerful. You'd be amazed, even if they're blinded here, where like it doesn't have some sexy logo of some famous company you've seen there, but it's actual data of what a customer's return has been. So in this case, it's like, okay, they paid us $3,000, they got 3 fees out of it, there's 37 grand, here's a 12x ROI. And so it makes it such that that individual can then quickly understand, like, oh, okay, cool. Well, like if this is how this looks for all the other customers, this is probably how it's going to look for me. Relatedly, they could do a better job here by making that easy for someone and not having to do that math themselves, by saying something along the lines of like, yeah, we're going to recover around $10,000 per recruiter per year, because in that way the prospect can say like, oh, okay, well I have 15 recruiters, so that's 150 grand, so sweet. I guess I'll pay you 15 grand. This is an example of ROI precursor information here. So the problem with like Talent Bin is that there isn't necessarily like a closed loop component. We got better with this over time because from a product management standpoint, we started to think about how we could build features that would capture ROI signifiers, both from a renewal standpoint, so we could go back to the customer and say, by the way, you got this value out of here. We know that you got this value out of it because it was captured, in the workflow tool. But even ahead of that, before we had that, we could do things like this. We can say, look, here are all the different places where there are people who are using our product, and here's the delta between important, search results in those various geographies. You can also do full ROI studies. Like, this is an extraordinarily busy slide. This is more something that, like, when someone says, like, oh, well, do you have ROI Proof? And you're like, yeah, we have a whole ROI study right here that goes through all the different actions that an individual recruiter would take and shows how our automation accelerates them and reduces the time and so on and so forth. We're not going to go into it right now, but like, I'm sure your boss will ask about it later. So don't worry, we've done the work to prove this to you. This is an example that that a firm uses, which I think is kind of cool, where they do a good job of like making it unit based. So they say, hey, for every $10 million in sales, in annual sales, so it's for e-commerce companies, these are the different permutations that you could have coming out of it. So you could say, hey, you know what, we're only going to get 5% of your share of cart, and you're not going to have that big of an AOV increase, so it's going to be 630 grand per $10 million. Or on the flip side, like maybe you get high share of cart because you do a good job of merchandising a firm on product detail pages, and the AOV increase is going to be high because your customers' installment payments really resonates with those folks. It'll be $2.4 million. Conveniently, someone can say, oh, well, we do $100 million in gross merchandise value a year, so if we're here, maybe that'll be $20 million in lift. So it makes it very easy for that. Not only do they have kind of like a choose your own adventure model here, which is good, as opposed to just stating like you're going to get this ROI, which may be a little harder for somebody to swallow. But at the same time, they capture the value of making it really like unit-based and easy so the person can do the math themselves. So that's quantitative proof. That's usually the best thing to lead with. But qualitative proof is also helpful. And all of this comes under the heading of proof points, where oftentimes prospects will say, do you have customer success stories? Do you have ROI proof and things like that? These are when they ask for a specific type of collateral, really what they're asking for is this genre. So even if you don't have the specific thing you're asking for, you can respond back and say, well, actually, yes, we have all of these proof points. Here they are. Customer success story is a great example of this, puts a face to it. It's really just kind of like a textual version of these prior kind of quantitative and qualitative arguments. One thing to focus on is your key segments and verticals. So use talent as an example. We sold to mid-market and enterprise. We had verticals as well. So we started out in tech. We moved into healthcare. We moved into finance. As we added more data sources, you would want to have coverage on each of those because that's what the person's going to want to see. Oh, there's a human who looks like me that works for a company that I aspire to work at, maybe, or is a good reputation issuer. And then you would like to put the success story in question should tie to the pain points in your solution statements. And the best way to do that is to write it for them because they don't want to write it for you anyway because they've got their day job. So if you can write it for them, make them look brilliant, and then send them a $150 OpenTable gift card afterwards for that, you'll just have stacks of these. It's a great way of making sure that you have a bunch of these in your back pocket. But if you don't want to necessarily be as intentional as that, you can do something like this. Again, more anecdata. You can, citing tweets is like the new customer success story. Talk about MVP. You just like go and search for your company and then selectively pull the ones that are good. You can also do things like, this is kind of the proof point version of the pain point anecdata. In this case, it can just be about somebody stating that drip marketing is important for recruiting. Doesn't say anything about talent bin. Just says that like drip marketing is important for for recruiting. Or like, if you don't have a mobile solution for your sales force, you're in the Stone Ages, and immediately would do something like that. So this right here is all about the solution. There's one thing that you have to think about is kind of company reputation. A lot of organizations start with this, and this is related to like the fundraising deck. When you show up and you're like, and here are our founders, and we are all very smart and worthy, and we went to these schools, and we are backed by these people. Your prospect doesn't care about that at the beginning of your presentation, but if they're convinced that they have the problem, that your solution, they have the problem, the current solutions are insufficient, and yours smells like it might be good, they're going to want to know that you're going to be around. right? That's not the first thing they care about. They only start caring about that after they're convinced. So how can you do that? You can do things like awards. You can say, hey, look, here's this press that has covered us, analysts, and then this is where you can kind of talk about other reputation issuers like your VCs, for instance. Also, like, yes, if you pay me $20,000, the servers will be up at least for a year. Don't worry, we're not going away. This is like totally a corner case, but if you can have it, you should use it. If you do have people who are, and this is an important thing, they have to be known to the prospect, right? Either the company that they founded. So Affirm is a good example of this. It's founded by Max Levchin and Nathan Gettings. Max founded PayPal. Nathan founded Palantir. I wouldn't have put Nathan on this slide, actually, because the people that you're selling to, that Affirm is selling to, merchants and kind of like digital marketers and things like that, they're like, whoa, PayPal. What the hell is Palantir? So I think what you've got going on here is a little bit of that kind of like founder ego thing kind of showing up. So like if I were to refactor this slide, I'd probably drop Nathan and I'd probably put a big PayPal logo next to Max's face. Oh yeah, the PayPal guys, cool. That has something to do with money. So does Affirm. Again, this is something that's like probably not going to apply to most of us. But if you have like board members, or if you happen to be a worthy, multi-time entrepreneur like Rick, for instance, you might be able to get away with something like this, right? But again, it's not the first thing that you would do. And then of course there's like the logo slide. This is the way that most people do this. It's a great approach. People are oftentimes really wigged out about how you can do this. Again, like the customer success stories, you want to have your segments and verticals covered. So you would you want your prospect to see people that look like them, or that they would ideally that are like one level of status above them on there as a reputation issuer. So make sure that you have coverage across all that. So in our case, you can see we have like a bunch of tech companies, but then we also have agencies. So like Kelly is an agency. What else do we have here? There's another agency on here somewhere. One thing to be careful of is that like as you get to scale, people will know people at these companies. So if they see somebody, if they see that you sold to Bonobos, you probably only want to put somebody on here if they're stoked on the solution. Because if somebody's going to go on back channel to that person, and it turns out that either they churned or they're grumpy or had a bad customer success experience, that is the opposite goal of this slide. One thing that folks freak out about is they're asking for permission and gating the construction of a slide like this on getting permission from organizations. This kind of depends on how you're going to use it, and it also kind of depends on your solution. Generally speaking, if you're an early stage startup and you're under 50 customers, you have bigger things to worry about than if some PR organization is going to get grumpy at you. So it's the way that I approach this is ask forgiveness instead of permission. And one of the ways, so just put it on there and then present it. That doesn't mean send it, because as soon as you send it, now it's in an email and it can fly all over the place. Again, if somebody knows someone at that organization, hey, did you know that you're in the sales presentation? Another way you can do this is just bake it into your master service agreement. So it's just like they agree to publicity rights in it, because most people will just click through the echo sign and like you got it. And then afterwards they're like, oh, well, my PR org is pissed about this. Oh, okay, cool, we can deprecate that. Oh, it was in the MSA, but we can pull that away. As you get bigger, you're going to have to do more fancy footwork here, but most of this is all focused on like getting you through this first 100 customers, and you should bias towards creating these reputation signifiers without creating a lot of like overhead for yourself. This is something that we used to screw up a lot at TalentBin, and I think the next event is one of them is customer success. Is that right, Rick? Okay, customer success. All right, I think founders do this a lot, where they sell a deal and they're doing a happy dance because they're so stoked that someone actually gave them money for their solution that they totally forget that maybe you might have to implement them, and it's not sufficient just to like send them the credentials and be like, okay, cool, have fun, we'll talk to you in 12 months. And so one of the ways that you can avoid that, and these folks are familiar with like shelfware, SaaSware, is you can actually speak to why this is going to be so easy. Like, okay, you're convinced that this solution makes sense. By the way, we're also dedicated that you're going to get the value out of this. So the Affirm guys do a really good job of this, of kind of like, oftentimes it's just one of those things where they want to see that there is a playbook, even though you don't have to necessarily dig into it. But having it kind of in the deck. So this is the Talbin one. Doesn't look all that great, but the idea here is like, actually, we speak to this. And moreover, you know, potentially put something in there that maybe is a little bit of like what's in it for me, for the end user. So in Talbin's case, you know, you get Talbin certified. Oh, you can get Talbin certified, so I buy this software that makes my job easier, and I get this handy dandy little thing that I can put on my LinkedIn profile. So you can merchandise things like that. And again, it can be super basic. So this is like life guides right here. Like this is their nod to customer success, is a picture of their CTO pretending to be a customer success manager, right? But at least it's in there and spoken to, because a mature purchaser is going to be concerned about that. Pricing, they're going to ask, so I always would have it in there. You're going to want to, rather than having, I know everyone likes to do the box or Salesforce or New Relic thing where there's like 3 different options or what have you. Like, this is advice for when you're under 100 customers. Just start, like, lead with the thing that lead with your common pricing case, like the enterprise version. Ideally, you're selling to the same ideal customer profile and again. So have a slide that has mid-market pricing versus enterprise pricing or what have you, just focus in on one customer to start. And make sure that you're characterizing like your peak rack rate, because like you're going to discount. But by framing it that, okay, that this is, in Talbin's case, this is actually an old slide, $6,000 per seat per year per recruiter. And a bunch of other stuff here was mainly around like, and you get all this other stuff, isn't it magical? The same thing with life guides here, but keeping it simple is important. So that's the main kind of like thrust of things. One thing that I find important that I ask folks to think about is appendices. Like, you don't want to have a main slide deck where you're just kind of like trying to like chug through it in the face of the customer. So you can, if something isn't all that terribly important, but it may come up, put it in the appendix. It's great for like objection handling, where, because like you don't want to put a slide that is about objection handling in the beginning of the presentation, which essentially like brings up a potential problem, right, for the customer. But if they bring it up, the fact that you can jump to it immediately and be like, oh yeah, funny you should ask that, it's handled, is a great way of doing that. So good example here is like sometimes drip marketing is another, the thing, kind of the theme we were talking about. Hey, isn't this kind of spammy? Well, no, it's actually good recruiting, and here's why. Here's a bunch of examples of people who are like, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry I didn't get back to you. This opportunity sounds really sweet. So the way that I like to say this, same with kind of like fundraising as well. Like the second time you hear it, just make a slide, because then you're going to look amazing when you pop to it. Wow, this person really has their act together. And it provides a crutch for you to have your best argument possible right there in front of you. Also for kind of like edge case features. So if there's something that like isn't all that terribly important for your solution, but 10% of your customers are going to ask for it, oh, how do you integrate with this? You don't want to have that in the main deck. You want to have that in the backlog. So that's kind of like the main overarching points. A couple other things that are kind of like meta points here that's related to kind of the MVP concept. The one thing I would say to folks is, don't just because you've looked at an Oracle sales deck or a Marketo sales deck or an Eloqua sales deck or what have you, you may think that it has to be super shiny and exhaustive and what have you. Don't let that gate you on creating even just some basic slides, right? You can start out with something that's super bare bones like this. Like, you could have a sales deck that really is just like a bunch of bullet points that are shiny bullets. At least it would be better than just doing a full demo without any framing whatsoever. You can get better into kind of the visuality, and you can go into the specific subpoints, and then you can get super crazy later on, but you can choose to do that, right? You can start with that and you can say, you know what, I'm really, I'm really burnt out on this other task that I was working on. I'm gonna dip down into like the lower buckets of my Asana to-do list for it to do some productive procrastination, recreation. Cool, I guess I'll blow this slide out into 4 slides. It'll be a nice little 2-hour respite, right? That's how I've approached these sort of things, is kind of filling in other time. And then lo and behold, what ends up happening is over time, you get, where was it? Much like your code base in your product, it will get more embellished and better. Like, unfortunately, there's not GitHub for PowerPoint. I wish there were. But one thing to do is just to think of this as kind of like your master deck that you're building over time, and you kind of just fork off versions of this and then load that into ClearSlide or Join.me or DocSend, such that you're never destroying, quote unquote, like marketing code in this case. Last couple of points is related to kind of this. Of like you can be super bare bones. You don't have to have amazing production value to start. If you have a designer, or you can go like through an Odesker, that's great. But don't gate on it. Like having the argument is better to have than having it look sexy. That said, some very basic templating can get you kind of far. And oftentimes you'll have this from your fundraising, so that's super helpful. Yeah, and we covered this already. So that's pretty much everything I wanted to cover. I know there's a lot of material, and but the idea is that this is something that you guys can come back to as you're working on these things yourself and refer back to this framework. Much of this stuff is on first round review, and then this specific slide deck right here with hyperlinks to kind of the text versions there of it. I tweeted it earlier, so if you just like Google Kazanji Twitter right now, it'll be like the top. I forewent tweeting about other stuff this morning in order to make sure that it's the top hyperlink that is on there. Also check out Founding Sales. It's the book that I'm writing right now. That account doesn't tweet very much, but when it does, it's actually like a new chapter, which is good, and it's designed for the folks that are in this room. So thanks for the time.